Hello, my name is Dr. Fear. I want to thank you for watching my video. If you enjoy listening to scary stories and watching scary video compilations, please hit that subscribe button so that you can be notified when I release new content. If you enjoy this video, I ask that you please hit that like button and leave a comment as it does help my channel enormously. Now, without further ado, kick back, dim the lights, and enjoy the story.
The story you're about to hear is real. I've finally decided to go public with my experiences after nearly 3 decades, with just a few close family members and friends knowing. This was my first occurrence with shadow people growing up. I had many more, mostly in my preteens to teens. Most of my paranormal experiences occurred within a range of 15 or so years, give or take. My earliest experience began when I was 3 years old or so, and my last profound experience tapered off around 19 years old. The story begins with my first paranormal experience of shadow people. My parents met in the late 80s, and they were both serving members of the military. Shortly after they met, both of my parents were assigned to an Air Force base in Ontario. I was born there, and my brother followed shortly afterwards. Roughly a year after my brother was born, we transferred to the province of Quebec. We were located in a highly francophone region in Quebec, where my father had been posted to an army base. My parents decided to buy a house in the neighboring town. It wasn't a luxury home, but I enjoyed my time there as a kid. We had a large backyard which I spent a lot of time in. The history of the house is unknown to my family. From the looks of it, the house didn't appear haunted. It wasn't bent out of shape. It was just a 1970s to 80s cookie-cutter house in an ordinary middle-class neighborhood. I suppose this might be one of many visions of what a basic family home would look like in North America. In this house, at 3 years old, everything started. We were what I thought was an average family, but happy and in good health. Nobody had any serious issues, the family dynamic was awesome, and my dad was incredibly creative and fun. For the most part, we were good children. We did well in our early school years, and we weren't too spoiled, especially because we couldn't afford to be. But my mother did everything she could to pamper me and my brother. She wanted a good life for us. She would save money to ensure that we always had new clothes and shoes for school. She always taught us good manners, to treat all people with respect, and not to judge others. Despite their eventual separation, they remained being amazing parents. They always did their best to offer us a good life. When we moved to this town, my mother sacrificed her service to follow my father's. I believe it was a fluke that they were previously posted to the same base because in the 1980s, career managers were not as accommodating to service couples as they are now in Canada. She decided to use this opportunity to raise her children and look after the home until we were old enough to look after ourselves. Once you entered the front door of the house, there was a small square area for removing your boots and hanging your keys. There were 2 sets of stairs directly in front of you. One to the ground floor, the other to the basement. Below, and directly to the left, there was a bathroom, and inside the bathroom on the left side there was a small storage space. The space was large enough to kneel down and walk into, so my dad used the space to develop film since it was a dark and secluded room. While the restroom was on the left, my room was on the right, which was beside my parents' room. I had a small window in my bedroom on the left side that had a partial view of our large, fenced-in backyard. I couldn't see anything though since the window was located high enough on the wall and I was almost at the basement level. Plus I was a little guy. I vividly recall many details. My parents purchased my bed for me when we moved into that house. It was lifted up onto a metal frame and painted bright red, like a maraschino cherry. There was also a railing that my parents later took off when I became older. It was between the age of 3 to 4 years old, but well before kindergarten before I experienced something so impactful that it would forever be burned into my head until this day. Most nights we probably went to bed between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. We were familiar with the routine and we followed it. We had a very military style of discipline in our home. Not only were my parents in the military, but so were the previous generations in my family, and that culture carried on. We weren't perfect kids, but I like to think that we were well-behaved kids. One night, which looks identical to all other nights as a child except for Christmas, I awoke in my cherry red bed. I knew it was late because it was dark outside from my window, but not so late that my parents were asleep because I could hear them talking upstairs with the TV on. I struggled to fall asleep, so I lay down on my bed looking around the room like a curious child. I was getting uncomfortable, so I turned over to my left side, which would have been facing the door to my bedroom. It was dark enough in the room, but I was in my room long enough for my eyes to be well adapted to the darkness at this stage. The only light I had in my room was the gentle backside of a faint porch light, and any ambient light from the moon, if any. I looked around the room, and then I began to draw my attention to my bedroom door. It had passively piqued my interest because I noticed that the area located directly in front of my closed bedroom door was unusually dark. I remember being able to look at the surrounding walls, but not that specific area for some reason. I kept watching the black mass, and I looked away a few times. Still looking around the room, I looked back at the door, and in confusion saw an opaque figure in the outline of a person standing right there. It was probably about 8 feet away or so, give or take. I wasn't initially scared, and instead I think I kind of giggled, thinking it looked like a person, and that some object in my room was obviously creating a very telling shadow of a humanoid. I kept looking in the shadows, but I started to realize something seemed strange. The shadow itself was not on the wall. It was off the wall, in the room, standing like a person and an opaque black in color. No light seemed to come through. It was not transparent. It was not translucent. It was a deep black hole black. I was still confused, and I didn't put too much thought into it, so I kept gazing. One moment I was relaxed and intrigued as to what was causing this image in front of me, but in the next, I was struck with a paralyzing fear as I started to see the figure move towards me. It wasn't walking like a human or something I even recognized on the planet at that moment in my life. There were almost no features. There was no face, but I could clearly discern the shape of the body, arms, legs, and so on. He resembled a man. When the shadow approached me, it didn't do so by walking. There were no fluid, human-like limbs moving around in human-like or even earth-like fashion. This shadow would vanish, then reappear a step or two closer in a moment, as fast as a shutter can trigger on a camera. I didn't stop looking. I could not shout. I trembled, I cried, and I had my blanket set against my eyes. But I kept watching, as if it was a film. It continued to move itself towards me, disappearing, reappearing, disappearing, reappearing, until he stood right over me by my nightstand. I was petrified by that moment. With speed, I threw my blankets over my head and buried my face as deeply into the pillows and blankets as I could without suffocating. It never left. My eyes were closed, but it made no difference. 3 of these shadows were penetrating their way into my mind even though my eyes were sealed shut. These shadows were morphing vividly into horrifying faces, shapes, and grotesque images, all with the purpose of causing overwhelming fear. I could see them in my head. They were clear as day. It was almost like they were telling me, "You can't hide from us." I felt them taking great pleasure in my fear. It was very dark and sinister, and I couldn't get these figures to leave. I felt trapped, like a deer being surrounded by wolves. I could no longer bear it, as I knew I had no place to hide. Somehow, I had the courage to dash out from my room and scream for my parents. I remember running up the stairs to the living room, tripping on the way as I shouted, "Mom! Dad! I have a man in my bedroom!" I was emotionally distraught, weeping, trembling, and hyperventilating. My mother did what I think most moms would do, and tried to reassure their kid that it was just a dream and to go back to sleep. I insisted on the fact that there was a man in my room. My parents took me back to bed, turned on the light, and said a prayer while leaving a holy crucifix underneath my pillow. It is the only case I can recall in this specific town, but it wasn't my last experience. They came back at times later in my life, from the age of 9 to 18, and at a much higher intensity.